The first attack was monstrous. The crystal ship materialized above the Australian continent on what had begun as an ordinary day. There was no warning, no cryptic signal from the stars. It simply appeared, defying the laws of physics and expectations alike. For a moment, the world stood still, captivated by the sheer alien beauty of the vessel that hovered like an impossible gem against the blue sky. Then it began to snow. What at first seemed to be delicate snowflakes made of light drifted down from the ship, carried on an invisible wind to every corner of the globe. People stepped outside, mesmerized by the ethereal display, watching in awe as the flakes floated down to meet them. It was beautiful, enchanting, until it touched them. The moment the glowing particles made contact, the vulnerable vanished. The elderly, the sick, the infirm, and, most tragically, children and their parents disappeared as if they had never existed. No screams, no bodies, no trace of their being left behind. Just empty spaces where people had been, as if erased from reality. The survivors, those left standing in the suddenly desolate world, heard a single thought in their native tongues, a command that echoed through their minds like the tolling of a death knell. Fight. There was no time for mourning. Governments scrambled to respond. In a rare and desperate display of unity, the nations of Earth came together. Old enemies became allies, past grievances forgotten in the face of this unprecedented threat. The fury of Earth was unleashed against the alien invaders with all the force that humanity could muster. Fighter jets soared into the skies, ships armed to the teeth set sail, and missiles streaked towards the enigmatic vessel that had appeared without warning. But it was all in vain. The alien ship hung in the sky, untouched by the furious assault. Missiles detonated harmlessly against its surface, fire and smoke billowing in impotent rage. Not even nuclear weapons could breach its crystalline shell. Humanity's greatest weapons, designed to end wars, were nothing more than fireworks in the face of this intruder. Then, the ship responded. It rained down death in the form of soldiers, creatures that seemed conjured from the darkest nightmares. They were translucent spiders the size of horses, moving with an unsettling grace across the ruins of human civilization. Each one carried a venom so potent that it caused its victims to dematerialize in seconds, leaving behind no more evidence of their existence than the ethereal snowflakes that had heralded their coming. In the first 6 months, these creatures ravaged the world's defenses. Armies that had stood for centuries were annihilated. Cities fell into silence, and the human race teetered on the brink of extinction. It seemed that no weapon, no strategy, no sheer force of will could stand against the onslaught. But even in the face of such overwhelming odds, humanity did not yield. Amid the chaos and despair, a new leader emerged. Rastapan Andino, once a master sergeant in an army that no longer existed, had gathered the remnants of human resistance. To the shattered survivors, he was known simply as the General. On the day the spiders first descended, Rastapan had led his unit, and anyone else he could find, into deep underground bunkers originally built to protect heads of state. From there, he organized what was left of humanity's militaries into a ragtag resistance. They struck back, scavenging weapons and supplies from the ruins of their former homes, fighting back against the alien invaders with a grim determination. They learned. They adapted. Bullets were ineffective, but blades, axes, swords, spears could cut through the spiders as if they were flesh and bone. They discovered that injecting near-fatal doses of adrenaline could counteract the spider's venom, saving those who were bitten from a fate worse than death. Even so, it was not enough. The world had changed irrevocably. The alien snow had never stopped falling, and with it, no new life could be born. Every death, no matter how it occurred, resulted in disappearance, as if the very fabric of humanity was being unwoven. The realization set in. They were a race without a future, fighting not for victory, but for revenge. Rastapan knew this better than anyone. The last vestiges of hope had been extinguished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He looked at the faces of those around him, soldiers, civilians, anyone who could hold a weapon, and saw that same determination mirrored in their eyes. They were not fighting to win. They were fighting to make the enemy bleed. Beneath the scarred surface of a devastated Earth, humanity clung to survival like a flickering candle in a tempest. Rastapan Andino, now known simply as the General, stood at the center of this fragile flame. What remained of humanity's military and civilian populations had gathered in hidden enclaves, scattered across continents and connected by a web of underground tunnels and bunkers. They had been driven underground not just by the threat of the alien spiders, but by a grim recognition that the world above was no longer theirs. Rastapan's command center, deep within the remnants of a Russian military complex, was a hive of frantic activity. Maps covered the walls, each one marked with colored pins and lines that showed the dwindling locations of human resistance cells. Soldiers and strategists moved like shadows around him, faces gaunt with exhaustion and resolve. The general, a towering figure with a broad frame hardened by war, surveyed them with a piercing gaze. "The spiders have shifted their focus," said Donovan Clark, Rastapan's oldest friend and closest advisor. Donovan was a wiry man, quick with a joke in better times, but now his eyes were hollow, and his voice carried the weight of 1,000 lost battles. He pointed to a cluster of red pins on the map, where the spiders had been sighted most recently. "They're trying to cut us off from the western bunkers." Rastapan's jaw tightened. He knew what that meant. If the western bunkers fell, they would lose not just thousands of survivors, but also the last working nuclear missiles they had managed to secure. And if they lost those, their final plan, their one last desperate plan, would be rendered impossible. "Can we hold them?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "We've sent everyone we can spare," Donovan replied. "But they're running out of time." Time. It was the one resource more precious than any weapon, and the one they had so little of. He turned his gaze away from the maps and looked at the people around him. Soldiers, scientists, even farmers and teachers, all of them fighting for a world that no longer existed. A world where they had once dreamed of a future. And now, every day brought them closer to extinction. In the corner of the room, Mary Collins, Rastapan's wife and the Resistance's chief medic, was working over a young soldier who had been brought in from the front lines. The soldier's skin was pale, and his body was racked with tremors as he clung to the edges of consciousness. Mary's hands moved with practiced efficiency, injecting adrenaline into his veins, hoping to stave off the effects of the spider venom. "Will he make it?" Rastapan asked, his voice softening as he approached her. Mary glanced up, her eyes weary but still burning with the fierce light that had drawn him to her all those years ago. "He has a chance," she replied, her voice tight with both hope and resignation. "But I'm running out of supplies. We can't keep this up much longer." Rastapan's heart clenched. They were running out of everything: supplies, time, people. Every day, their numbers dwindled, and yet they fought on. Because what else could they do? Surrender was not an option. There was nothing left to surrender to. "We have to hold out," he said, his voice a low growl. "We have to." Mary placed a hand on his arm, squeezing gently. "We will," she said, and in her eyes he saw the same determination that kept him going, the same burning need for vengeance that had become their only driving force. He turned back to Donovan. "Get me a line to the western bunkers," he ordered. "I need to speak with their commander." Minutes later, the grim face of Colonel Vasily Petrov filled the cracked screen of the communication terminal. He was bloodied and battered, his uniform torn, but his eyes were sharp and defiant. "General," Petrov said, his voice steady despite the sounds of chaos and gunfire in the background, "we're holding them off, but I don't know how much longer we can last." Rastapan nodded. "Hold as long as you can. Vasily, the missiles, are they ready?" Petrov's eyes flickered with understanding. "They're ready," he confirmed. "But if we don't get reinforcements soon—" "There are no reinforcements," Rastapan interrupted, his voice like steel. "It's all on you now. You have to make sure those missiles launch." Petrov nodded once, a single, sharp movement. "Understood." The screen went dark, and Rastapan turned back to his people. Every face was etched with the same grim resolve. They knew what was at stake. This was not a war for victory. Not anymore. It was a war to make the enemy bleed. To make them pay for every inch of ground they took, for every life they stole. In the end, it wasn't about survival. It was about making sure that when humanity fell, they would take the invaders down with them. And if they could launch those missiles, if they could coat the earth in a final, burning message, then maybe, just maybe, they could show the aliens that humanity was not a race that surrendered. The room fell silent as Rastapan looked at them all. "This is it," he said, his voice carrying the weight of every soul lost in the fight. "We've given everything. Now we give a little more." The blinding light of the missile's launch was the last thing Rastapan Andino saw before everything went dark. He had braced himself for oblivion, expecting the searing heat of nuclear fire to be the final sensation of his life. But instead of nothingness, he felt a disorienting jolt, as if reality itself had been ripped away and stitched back together. He blinked, the world coming back into focus around him. He was no longer on the battlefield, no longer surrounded by the chaos and carnage of war. Instead, he stood in his old office. The one he had occupied before the invasion had torn everything apart. The room was exactly as he remembered it, down to the stacks of paperwork on his desk and the faint hum of the ceiling fan above. He turned, expecting to see the specters of his past, those he had lost in the fight, but instead he saw them as they had been, alive and confused. Linda Trevor, his former secretary, was staring at him with wide eyes. Donovan Clark, his oldest friend, was frozen in the act of lighting a cigarette, the lighter still sparking in his hand. Mary, his wife, stood beside him, her eyes searching his with a mixture of shock and relief. "What the F?" Rastapan began, but his words were cut off by a sudden, searing pain in his mind. It wasn't physical, but a psychic intrusion, a presence that forced its way into his thoughts with a cruel, mocking familiarity. A voice, resonating in 1,000 languages, yet unmistakably condescending, filled the room. A monstrous spider, draped in opulent jewels and silks, materialized before them, its multifaceted eyes glinting with arrogance. "We are the Zalem," the creature intoned, its mandibles clicking with the rhythm of ancient arrogance. "We have come to conquer you." The words hung in the air, surreal and detached, as if spoken from a dream. Rastapan's confusion melted into a cold fury as the creature continued, oblivious to the hatred radiating from every human in the room. "The current message is being sent only to those who participated in the war," the Zalem warlord said, its voice a sneer in his mind. "Do not worry for your meek and young. We have spared them this fate." Rastapan clenched his fists, the muscles in his arms taut with barely restrained rage. Around him, his companions were reacting in similar fashion, their faces twisted with anger and bewilderment. They had fought, they had bled, and they had died, only to be told it had all been for nothing. The Zalem continued, oblivious to the rising tide of defiance. It spoke of their history, of a time when they had nearly conquered the galaxy through force alone. But that conquest, the warlord explained, had proven too costly. Entire worlds reduced to rubble, trillions of lives lost. So they had devised a new method, war by simulation. They would break the spirits of their prey without firing a single shot, without losing a single warrior. The humans had been their latest test, and, according to the Zalem, a most amusing one. "We will restart the simulation," the warlord declared, its voice dripping with disdain. "If you do not surrender, this is your final chance." The psychic broadcast ended, the warlord's image fading into nothingness. For a moment, there was only silence in the room. Then, slowly, the people around Rastapan began to stir. The shock was giving way to something deeper, something darker. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface was now a roaring fire. Rastapan looked around, at the faces of those who had fought and died beside him. Linda, whose defiance in the face of death had earned his respect. Donovan, who had given his life to buy them a few precious seconds. Mary, who had died in his arms, her last breath a promise of love unfulfilled. He felt the weight of their expectations, the unspoken question that hung in the air. What now? What do we do now? Rastapan took a deep breath, his mind racing. He thought of the years of suffering, the countless lives lost in a war that had been nothing but a cruel game. The fury coiled within him, a tight, seething knot of hatred and resolve. He reached for the comm unit on his desk, his voice steady as he connected to the Zalem warlord. "You want us to surrender?" Rastapan's voice was calm, but there was an edge of steel beneath the surface. "You think we'll just roll over and accept this because you've shown us that nothing we did mattered?" There was a pause. Then the warlord's voice slithered back into his mind, arrogant and assured. "Yes, surrender, and we will spare you further pain." Rastapan barked out a laugh, a harsh, mirthless sound. "You don't get it, do you?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You've shown us there are no consequences. So, if you think we're just going to lie down and take this, you're dead wrong." He looked at his people, saw the fire in their eyes, and knew he spoke for all of them. "Get your trashy holodeck ready, Spock," he growled. "Let's make it best 2 out of 3. The warlord recoiled, stunned into silence by the defiance that radiated from the humans. But before it could respond, Rastapan cut the connection, a savage grin on his face. He turned to his people, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. "We've faced the end, and we chose to fight. We'll fight again and again and again until they realize we're not something they can break." And with that, the room erupted in cheers, a defiant cry of a species that had been pushed to the brink and found only steel and fury at its core. They had been shown the futility of their struggle, and instead of surrender, they had found a new purpose. They would not be conquered. They would not be broken. The Zalem had unwittingly given them a gift, and humanity would make them regret it. The war was far from over, but Rastapan knew one thing with absolute certainty. The Zalem had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the humans.